Well, hello there, partner. Pleasure to see ya. Taking a look here at the civil rights movement a little bit longer. In particular, this lesson 3, we're looking at a shift in vision. Taking a look instead of at civil rights, issues with the economy. So what we're going to be looking at here then is how African Americans in the 1960s shift their focus from civil rights to economic rights. Remember, between 1954 and 1965 really, we see a string of civil rights victories culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So now we need to try and find another focus for those folks who were protesting because, look, even though we have all of those laws that now say we're equal, we know that racism is still out there and racism still exists. So we want to see, number one, what's the biggest problem that still exists? And that answer there is that even with the political victories of the 50s and 60s, African Americans, Latinos, they still suffer economically due to the racism which is kind of stuck in those systems. A simple example, if you take a look at the 1950s and 1960s, what we know and what we see is that African Americans have an income that's only 55% of white families. So we know that based upon the problems of cities, based upon the problems that we see around our country, African Americans aren't going to have the same economic advantages that other Americans have, leaving them trapped in these inner cities. So what we're going to take a look at here throughout this section is how those economic difficulties kind of manifest themselves. What do they look like? What do they do? What do they result in? One of the things I think that's worth looking at here would be unemployment. Between 1973, just after the time we're talking and taking a look at here, in 2012, so what we're looking at is a really long time span as evidence of the kind of institutional racism that we're talking about, racism that can keep people who are ethnic minorities impoverished over time. So here's the unemployment rates for African Americans, and you can see here that in 73 it's just below 10%, higher than the Hispanic rate and way higher than the white rate, almost 6% higher than the white rate, and it consistently stays higher than every other group's, dipping down finally to kind of closing that gap by 2000, but then widening out again with the Great Recession. And in 2012, you can see that it's just as wide, if not wider a gap than what it was back in 1973, because take a look, right? Whites are at just over 6% in 2012, and African Americans are at 14%, 13%. That's a 7 or 8% difference. Here, it's only a 6%, 5% difference if you're at 9%, a little over 9%. So it's actually a worse situation off right now for unemployment rates regarding African Americans and Hispanics than it was back in 1973. So these kinds of institutional problems that we're talking about in the 60s and 70s are still problems today. So this frustration over economies, this frustration over lingering racism, it's going to erupt in riots. And we're going to see riots in places all over the country. The one right here on my pointer is in Watts, Los Angeles. It's the first really big riot that breaks out in 1964. And that's kind of like the lid being blown off the pressure cooker, because we're going to see a series of riots spread across our country over the next 4 years into dozens of cities. We're going to see the death toll increase dramatically across our country in race riots. We're going to see millions upon millions of dollars in property damage. For example, in Detroit alone, $200 million in property damage in the late 1960s. And one of the cities that experiences this violence, this outrage, is York, Pennsylvania. These are some images from York, Pennsylvania and its race riots in the late 1960s. And I just want you to understand kind of what happened in 1969 to lead to the York City race riots, where the National Guard had to be called out in armored personnel carriers, where the state had to actually lock the city down. They actually barricaded whole areas of York City to keep people from getting in or getting out because the violence was out of control. So what happens is that there is a rumor that starts. It's a false rumor that there was a black young man who had been burned, lynched by whites, and that started gang violence along Newbury Street. It started gang violence along Gay Avenue, and at that night we saw two youths actually shoot two young blacks being shot at West Philadelphia and North Pershing while talking to a city detective. And you're going to have 6 people wounded in the kind of the erupting gunfire. Other people are injured. There's a curfew that's imposed. The next day, 11 more people are injured by gunfire as violence kind of explodes even more. And then on the 19th, so 2 days after kind of this kind of explosion of violence, a city patrolman, Henry Schott, is shot and killed. A white officer shot and killed, dies 13 days later. The day after that, state police settle in on York City. The day after that, a South Carolina young girl, Lily Allen, is shot by white youths on Newbury Street, and she's gunned down. Dozens of people involved in that shooting. To this day, they're still working to try and solve that shooting. But the riots just get out of control. Curfews are in place. And it takes really almost 8 days, 9 days for the city to kind of calm down and kind of back off that riot. So this kind of thing was happening all over America, not just in big cities like Detroit or Baltimore. But isn't it interesting, though, that when we take a look at an America that sees many of the same problems now as we had in the late 60s and 70s with race and with economies, and the difference between white and black economies and white and black unemployment, that we would see race riots again? That shouldn't surprise you, folks. If people are treated unequally, they're going to get angry about it, right? So let's see kind of how this vision continues to shift throughout the end of the 1960s. So as the late 1960s kind of unfold, then what we're seeing here is going to be a shift in the vision for civil rights protesting amongst African Americans. King is going to say, we need no more nonviolent protests on civil rights. We need to have nonviolent protests on the economy. If we're going to see our people protesting, burning down cities across the country, then clearly we need to do some more work here on the economy. He's going to be contrasted by a new leader that's emerging, a man who promotes something called Black Power and Any Means Necessary, a guy named Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is going to approach this and say, I like what you did with civil rights, Martin Luther King, but you're not getting it done with the economy, and we need to kind of find a new way to move forward. And so what we'll see then, as we see this kind of contrast in vision, any means necessary versus nonviolent protest, what we'll see will be violence continuing. Not just riots like we've discussed before, but people even becoming assassinated, like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King themselves, as this violence kind of reaches a peak in the late 1960s. So all these riots are breaking out, all this anger is breaking out, and the government does what the government always does best, which is investigate. The government says we need to have a commission to take a look at this. They call it the Kerner Commission, and they do this exhaustive, comprehensive study. They interview all these people. They look at all of this data. They bring in all of these people. They go case by case, city by city, and they develop this amazing solution, this amazing understanding of the cause of this violence in America. Are you ready? Here's what they came up with. White society and white racism was the cause. Are you serious right now? White people were racist? Oh my God, I didn't even know. I had no idea. Oh, thank you, Kerner Commission. Thank you for spending our hard-earned tax dollars on coming up with that solution. We all appreciate it. In all seriousness, what we're going to see here is the committee saying we need to spend more money on inner-city jobs and on constructing new public housing. But the problem is we're not going to be able to do that. Why? Because President Johnson's fighting a war in Vietnam, a war that's going to keep him from having the money he needs to spend on butter because he's too busy spending it on guns. So the suggestions of the Kerner Commission, they go unheard. And it's this suggestion of the Kerner Commission going unheard that we really begin to see more and more black Americans saying, you know, black power might be a solution. Now, we looked at this a little bit briefly when we did those hate groups back in the 1920s, when we took a look at black nationalism. And the idea here, it's very close. Black power is close to black nationalism. Black power says we should stop asking white people for help because they're not going to give it. Why would they give it? They haven't given it for hundreds of years, so why are they going to give it now? Instead, black power says if a white person wants to attack you, defend yourself. Instead of asking and looking at white violence and then saying, hey, white politicians, look at the white violence, let's make some change, black America says we're going to use our economic strength. We're going to use our political strength to put pressure on you. We're not asking you for help. We're going to make you help. We're going to make you change. And really, what it's going to say is that instead of being BFFs forever, we need to have, in the Black Power movement, pride and cultural awareness of the differences between white and blacks. The group that becomes most synonymous with this is the Black Panther movement. If you've ever seen Forrest Gump, it's an old movie, but if you've seen it, there's this great scene where Forrest Gump runs through the whole Black Power party and goes, sorry if I messed up your Black Power party. Oh, there's a little cat over my shoulder. Hello, Shermie. Where did you go, Shermie? Oh, I don't know where he went off to. So what you're going to see here is that we're going to see groups like the Black Panthers, when they're not being interrupted by Forrest Gump, we're going to see them calling for black control of their neighborhoods, black people in charge of their neighborhoods, black people in charge of the schools, black people in charge of hospitals, black people in charge of the banks. If this is a neighborhood where mostly black people live, then black people should run the institutions in these neighborhoods, mostly black people in the police force. You take a step back, you look at the major institutions in American cities that have power, schools, health facilities, police and protection facilities, fire, government, dominated by whites. Was back then, still is now. Black power says that has to change. Martin Luther King says this idea of black power, of self-defense, and so that's hopelessness because it allows and encourages violence. That's hopelessness. You lash out in violence when you're hopeless. That's what Martin Luther King sees as one of the underlying reasons for the riots between 64 and 68. Hopelessness. So who's going to lead that movement, that Black Power movement that's challenging King's nonviolent civil disobedience? So the man that's going to lead this Black Power movement, that's going to really push the civil rights movement with its momentum, is a guy named Malcolm X. And again, he has that concept of any means necessary. And Malcolm X is an amazing person, right? Malcolm X, he was born Malcolm Little, ends up going to jail for burglary in 1946. But while he's there, he educates himself, he gets a degree, and he joins a movement, a black nationalist movement. Now remember, we had talked about black power on the last slide, this idea that blacks should be in charge of their existence and that black power does promote things like self-defense. Malcolm X is going to take that one step further. Malcolm X is going to say, we need black nationalism, and black nationalism is this idea that whites and blacks should be separate. Now that we had looked at back when we did the 1920s and those hate groups, this idea of black nationalism, which Marcus Garvey, in fact, there's your word that you want to write down and send into us, Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey had first promoted black nationalism back in the 1920s. And This group that he joins that promotes it is called the Black Muslims, and they're not mainstream Muslims the way that you would see a regular Muslim around the world, because these Muslims incorporate into their beliefs this concept of black nationalism, this concept of complete separation from the white race. While he's in jail, Malcolm Little is going to change his name to Malcolm X. He wants to break with his slave owner's past, and I don't know if you realize that or how many folks realize that. If your ancestry as an African American is rooted in slavery, then your last name as an African American, assuming a direct lineage between where you are right now all the way back to when you came over from West Africa, assuming that, then your last name would be the last name of your slave owner when you first came over. That's how that worked. You didn't come with the last name Little from West Africa, which was at the time a tribal society. You came with a different name, and you got the last name of your owner. And Malcolm Little doesn't want to recognize that. He wants to reject it. He believes in black nationalism, so he's going to change his name to Malcolm X, and he's going to say, we need to do this by any means necessary. Now, what I've done here in order to help you understand this is I have two things here, right? I have an Oreo and a glass of milk. Now, the glass of milk actually has no presence on this whole demonstration whatsoever, but it does serve as a delicious dunking tool for these Oreos that I'm eating. But what I do want to show you is this Oreo right here. This is Martin Luther King's Oreo. This is nonviolent civil disobedience. This is black America putting pressure on white America, smush, in order to create change, right? Provoke violence, white America lashes out, and all of a sudden, everyone realizes that white America is crazy and racist, and change needs to happen, and things get better for black America, right? Malcolm X says, that's no go, man. Why are we waiting for the double creamy filling to make the change? Why are we even hanging out with this double stuffed creamy white filling? We don't even need it. Malcolm X says, it's time for black nationalism. It's time to separate completely from white America. This is a beautiful, strong black cookie. Doesn't need this cream. Doesn't need it. Now, Malcolm X is actually going to change his views. Now, he had been preaching this idea of black nationalism, right? This concept that freedom cannot wait. Any means necessary, we will take our freedom now. But then, as a member of the black Muslims, he goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca. It's the holy city of those who practice Islam. And while in Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia, he sees Muslims of nations from all over the world there together, peacefully worshiping at the holiest site in the Islamic faith. It's this section right here called the Kaaba. And he realizes that if people of so many diverse races can practice a faith like Islam together as one group, then maybe integration is possible. Maybe with the right amount of patience, we can have a society that is, in fact, delicious. A perfect balance of black and white. Of course, these criticisms, this change in perspective, is going to really tick off the Nation of Islam, right? This black Muslim group that he had joined that was preaching black separation. And as a result, they shoot him. They kill him in Harlem after he gives his speech. And so he'll die. And the leader of the Black Power movement is seeing his life cut short. Now, Dr. King is also going to see his life cut short just a few short years later in 1968. He'll be in Memphis, Tennessee, helping striking sanitation workers try and get better jobs, better wages, trying to help them improve their economic conditions when he's shot by a sniper, James Earl Ray. And so what we're going to see here from this point forward is a civil rights movement without its leaders, and without its leaders to promote either vision, right? Any means necessary is gone, and so is nonviolent passive resistance. It's a leaderless group, and it will fracture and fall apart after the deaths of both of these men. If there is anything good that comes out of the death of King, it is, in fact, a Civil Rights Act of 1968, which does address housing, one of the big problems that African Americans had been facing in terms of discrimination when it came to sales and rentals, outlawing that discrimination. But that, by no means, is compensation for the loss of the leaders and the loss of the vision. And so, as we close this chapter out, we can see the civil rights movement making tremendous gains, tremendous strides in the 50s and 60s. But as we showed in that first slide with the economic differences between white and its ethnic minorities in America, there's still a lot of work to do. We'll talk about that more tomorrow in class.